You want to label your objects because once they come into your collection, fine, they get an accession number, but you want the number to live with the object so you can have the visual reference and know that that's the object that the file goes to. And maybe there's like 1,000 of these same items. How do you know which one's which? So the label goes with the object. You want it to stay with the object. You want it to, you want to allow for change and like flexibility, and like the labeling must be removable. You don't want it to become a permanent feature of the object, and you don't want it to cause any harm to the object, whatever labeling technique you use. So these are just some examples of no-nos. Again, the label does not become a permanent part of the object, so don't etch or scratch the number into the object. Things like tapes are not great. They're meant to be temporary solutions, not long-term ones. And so the adhesive, so you have the carrier, which is what we think of as the tape. So it's like the film of plastic or paper, whatever it is. And then beneath it is the adhesive that sticks it to the object. The adhesive over time will dry, will deteriorate, and the carrier like falls off. So usually the number was on the carrier. Now you've lost the number, it's useless to you, and then you've left adhesive stain on the surface of your object. So tapes are not a great idea. Sharpies, pens, whiteout, these can all stain the object. Do not use those. If you have a textile, don't use a sewing machine. That's kind of overkill. And anything with metal is also bad because metal will corrode and it will stain your object, and your labeling tag or whatever is probably going to fall off anyways and also become useless. And then you want to be conscious that you're not applying the labeling over any delicate, friable, flaking area or anything that has paint or decoration, dyes. You just want to find a smooth, plain area that's inconspicuous, that's easily disguised, that if you're going to do photography or if you're going to display it, it's not going to become like a prominent feature of the item. And here's like some good question to ask yourself when you're labeling an object. What's the purpose going to be? Is your label going to cause damage? Can you be able to remove it in the future? Are you going to be able to read it? But then it doesn't have to be so big that everyone and anyone who visits the museum or the collection can read it too. It has to be easily accessible, so you're not like manhandling the object to find the label. It's not like a scavenger hunt for the label. So you want to have it be a consistent method in your collection, that you always label things in the same place so that everyone using the collection knows to go to a specific area to look for it. Yes. So there's different ways to label objects. These are the two most common ones, B72, and then the laser printed labels are the ones that the videos discuss. Additionally, you can also use paper tags, which, you have like the little tag with the string attached to it. And those are also really useful and can be used for everything. They're just maybe a little harder to disguise for display purposes. But these are directly applied types of labels, the B72 and the printed ones. This is a picture of what B72 looks like in its raw form. B72 is a synthetic resin, and it has to be diluted with a solvent. So it's either ethanol or acetone. There's other solvents that you can use, but the main issue is that because you have to use a solvent, you have to have proper ventilation. You don't want to be like inhaling all these fumes. And there's also like an art and a science to diluting it. Like, how thick do you want it to be? How runny do you want it to be? So it's maybe not a system that you want to be using if you have no experience with it. You probably want to have someone that knows what they're doing teach you how to do it. So you would just, using a small brush, you would apply the B72 to the selected area of your object. You would write on it with a pen. You want to use something that is not going to be soluble in the solvent that you're using, and you want something that won't fade with light. So it'd be useless if you write down a number and then in a year you can't read it. And then you want to do a top coat. So that's why it's called a sandwich label. You can adapt the same laser printed labels. You can also adapt them to B72. So you would do the bottom coat of B72, put on the label, and then top coat it. But the method that I think we are recommending is using an acrylic emulsion. So it's a little cleaner and simpler. You print your label, so you have your accession numbers, you print, and it has to be super important. It has to be a laser printer. It cannot be inkjet. It cannot be the dot matrix. Those are soluble in water. Those will fade over time with light. Those will become illegible long term. It has to be laser printed. So you print the number. It has to be small, like just small enough that you can read it. You don't want like the label again to become a prominent feature of your item. You cut it, and it's just like a paste project, because you coat the underside of the paper with Roteflex or any other acrylic emulsion. It has to be a museum conservation grade kind of acrylic emulsion. There are specific brands that we can recommend for it. Not all of them are the same. Do not use Elmer's glue, for example. Do not. And then you put it on their object, and then you do the top coat. It's the same system. So that's the sandwich technique, and that's the one that's used the most. Here are some examples of the fonts that they recommend and the different sizes. The bold is really good for reading, especially when it's like smaller font, and also the character spacing. You don't want the letters to be too close together, because the tinier it gets, the harder it gets to read. So you want every letter to have like some space between it. And then you can also be as fancy as you want, and you can use QR codes and barcodes for your accession labeling system. Here are some examples of photographs that are all in sleeves, and you have a barcode. Now you would need a scanner, and that needs to like integrate into your management system. So how fancy you get with it is up to you and to your resources. I'm going to go over different types of materials and maybe some special considerations for them. As I had mentioned before, when you're dealing with things like antler and ivory and horn, and a lot of plastics were made to mimic these. So, and then also not all plastics are made the same. Some plastics are sensitive to solvents, some plastics are sensitive to water. So depending on what you have, you may want to use one system, or you may want to use a different system. It all depends. You can, if you don't know and you are unsure like what's best for it, you can also always use the label, the tag system, or you can, if it's like small pieces like this, these are like fragments of bones, you can put them in a little baggie and then label the enclosure. You just want to make sure that they don't become separated, and then you have an empty bag with a number and you don't know what goes in it. For baskets, you can pretty much use all of the above. You can use the paper tags, you can use the direct application. You can also use the sewing technique that we will be demonstrating for textiles. You just want to go on a smooth area, which can be hard with baskets because they have all those little bumps from the weaving. Usually it's on the bottom, and for most items, it's going to be on the bottom. You know, baskets, you just don't want to go in the middle where the star is, because that can also provide additional information. If there's, anytime you have multiple parts to an item, you want to label all the different parts. And because in the event that they become separated, then they can be reunited. For works of art or items on paper, then it's a different system. You always want to use a pencil. Never use the solvent with a paint system. Do not glue on paper labels to it. Always a pencil. You want to work on a hard surface so that you're not like indenting on your paper. It's just no pressure, just like let the pencil do its work. It will just glide across the surface. You want to use a HB or a, why is this like in the middle? Excuse me, everything's like covering my presentation. Here, a number 2 pencil. And you want to go on the underside. If it's like a document or a watercolor, just flip it over, and like on the edge, just write it small. Make sure you're not going over any design area, so you're not covering part of the image, you're not covering other inscriptions. If it's a book, again, lift the cover, and it's usually on the inside, or after you turn the title page, on the inside too. For photographs, you can do the same thing on the back. However, sometimes photographs have like a plastic film to them, and your pencil is just not gonna glide on it. It's not gonna ride. So they make these special blue pencils that are for photographs, so you can use those, and they're like a specific type of blue pencil. So if anyone wants to know more about that, I can tell them. It's not just any kind of blue coloring pencil, by the way. Again, ceramics always on the bottom. When you're dealing with fragments, This image is kind of funny. There's so many different fragments here, and they're all labeled, and there's a reason for it. If they're too heavy, you can always label the back, and remember, you just assign arbitrarily. You just decide where the back is sometimes. The bottom image, it's a ceramic that was put together, and initially they had only labeled one place for the overall piece, and then they went back and then they decided to label each individual fragment. I understand the logic behind this, because if for any reason these become separated in the future, then you know, like, these are all part of the collection, and it's not just like a random piece of ceramic that you have lying around. Again, you want to avoid any areas of painting, and you don't want to label on the break edge. You just want to label on the underside or a flat side. Things made out of feather, skin, leather are really hard to label because they can get any adhesive will stain the material. So usually if it's like feather items, they will be part of a bigger, like either regalia or rattle, things like that. So there's probably a different part of the object that you can label that's not directly on the feather. If it is a single feather and it's big enough, then you can probably label the bottom of the quill. You can, if you need to attach, you can go through existing holes to attach tags. You don't want to make a new hole ever. And then if you're dealing with taxidermy, usually you can use the tags like the one here, and they always go around like a foot or on the underside of a base, things like that. Same thing applies to glass. The only thing to keep in mind, sometimes you have glass beads and they're really tiny and it's hard to label. This is a really good solution. They use, these are coin holders, and they put the bead in it, and then they're labeling the outside, and then they're great because they also help facilitate handling of these small items. Something to keep in mind is glass disease. If you have weeping glass, if you notice that your glass is becoming powdery, it looks fragile, do not write on it. Metals, I don't recommend using the acrylic emulsions with metals. It's probably going to be better to do the B72 or the paper tags. As you can see from the bottom image of this penny, Roplex, which is an acrylic emulsion, it corroded the metal. If it contains copper, it will corrode, and you can see how the adhesive on the paper turned green and then the metal discolored. So just stay away from it, because it's really hard to tell when there's copper in metals. Just stay away from it. Just don't do it. You also want to be aware of coatings. A lot of times musical instruments have coatings on them. So if you use a solvent-based adhesive, it can dissolve the coating. Same applies for paints and things like that. Stone items, sometimes they're really heavy, and that can become the main concern with labeling. So again, go for the back. They can also be really porous and hard to adhere something to, especially if you're doing the Roplex method. You just want to make sure that, because that you're placing that isolating layer. When we always go about the B72 method, you paint on the B72 first, and what that does is it creates a barrier, so that then the ink that you apply over it doesn't permeate into the stone and becomes permanently embedded and stained into it. You also don't want to cover cut edges or things that give you information about how the object was made. Paintings, never ever. The biggest thing, the biggest takeaway from painting is just never ever place a label on the back of a canvas, because over time the canvas expands and contracts. It's just fabric that moves, and the label is going to become visible in the front. You're going to be able to tell the outline of the label. So you always just want to label the painting on the outside, the stretcher or the strainer. That outer support is where you want to put the labels on. And previous labels are really important to keep. You don't want to remove these from your collection. They provide a lot of information on the provenance of the item, who owned it before, and it's incredibly useful information. An example is the image of this painting here. It actually, so World War II, you had Germans looting art, and they took these paintings from private collections, they sold them. Years down the line, people are now being able to trace back the ownership of these paintings through these labels. So it's just an example of how you can use the labels on objects to document your collection and also find the rightful owners, or et cetera, et cetera. An easy way to also label paintings is if they have hanging hardware, you have like the little hooks on the sides, you can just loop a paper tag through those. And here's an example of it on the left. And then textiles, you don't want to paint on the textile. You don't want to glue on the textile. You're going to do stitching. So it's going to be a different type of label. Usually you'll find those wherever the manufacturer label usually goes. So it can be like in the back, it can be on the waistband. You don't want to cover the manufacturer's label. You just want to go next to it. You don't need a sewing machine for this. Don't overkill it. It's so unnecessary. I've seen ones where they go all around the edge and then they did the cross across it. It's like, it's on, trust me. And then again, the same for wooden objects. Things that are important about wooden objects to look for is coatings and paint, which are very common. Sometimes it's waxed and you can't tell that there's a coating of wax. So you want to go for an area that's not painted, that's inconspicuous. In these rattles, it might just be that the base of the rattle that would be where it's best to label it. You can also sometimes use pencil for wooden objects, but it might be harder to read because of the color. If it's too dark, you might not be able to read the pencil.